Welcome! Over the next several minutes, we're going to talk through chapters 8 and 9 of the Hebner text and explore some of the most salient points of both of these chapters. Chapter 9 is entitled Diverse Perspectives. It does a really nice job of bringing together research and conversations around multicultural concerns. As a framework, the chapter suggests that counselors and psychologists really need to be equipped to conduct and critically evaluate research in terms of cultural issues. Additionally, we see this importance of valuing diversity also as a means of reflecting the heart of God. And we see that in Scripture from numerous different passages where individuals are all a part of the body of Christ regardless of their nationality or race or gender. And so as Christian researchers and consumers of research, it's our responsibility to engage with research from a multicultural perspective, both from a professional mandate, but also from a spiritual faith mandate as well. Historically, psychological researchers have done a pretty poor job of considering cultural factors. The vast majority of research has focused on white middle-class cultures, and from that, different theories and different norms have developed. And so unfortunately, minority populations are often compared to that white norm, which is not accurate. Thankfully, over the past 15 or so years, there has been more of a focus on diverse populations, and this has really come about as multicultural psychology has kind of become this fourth force in the field. And so there is greater recognition of and appreciation for multicultural factors, and the shift is really exciting because behavior now is able to be seen within a cultural context rather than just being looked at as occurring within an individual. And so this promotes a much more complex understanding of human psychology. And with that, we recognize that an individual's identity is comprised of all these different various cultural dimensions, such as age, race, social status. And yet, we also want to recognize that there is ongoing debate around what's it actually mean to conceptualize multiculturalism. And the chapter explores just the challenges of operationalizing multicultural variables. So race, ethnicity, and culture, for example, have different meanings, but there can also be a lot of overlap between these meanings. Same with sex, gender, sexuality, social class, status, those sorts of variables. So that's important to consider. Additionally, we also want to make certain research design considerations when we're taking multiculturalism into consideration. And so the chapter talks through how oftentimes we want to begin a line of research, particularly if it's a new line of research within this multicultural framework. We want to start that from more of a qualitative or descriptive kind of approach because oftentimes we don't know a whole lot. And then as patterns develop and as trends and differences start becoming more apparent, we can then use theory-driven studies to examine more of what's going on. And so that adds some strength to our research. There's also a conversation in the text around distal and proximal factors that are both explanations of human behavior, where we have distal factors looking at more demographic kind of qualities or explanations, whereas the proximal factors are usually more psychological in nature. Here's a helpful graphic if you find that brings more clarity for you. And then moderator and mediator variables also have an impact where we have moderators affecting the direction or strength of a relationship, whereas mediators are accounting or maybe explaining that relationship. So this is very salient to multicultural variables and research designs. The text also talks through various threats to internal validity, and that's something that you can read in those pages. And then as we actually go through the process of an investigation, each of the key steps to that has cultural considerations that we want to take into consideration. So when we're looking at the research question, really we want that to be based in existing literature or any theories that we've been able to find that really are specific to that target population. And then it can also be helpful if we have personal knowledge or relationships that are collaborative within that culture. And so really what we're talking about is we want to closely tie this research question to the cultural context surrounding that target population. When we're choosing a research design, when we know less, we're going to tend to focus more on descriptive information and then later build theories or develop assessment tools, conduct quantitative studies, those sorts of things when we have more knowledge. Sampling, recruitment, and data collection all have cultural considerations as well. So as previously mentioned, our current psychological knowledge base tends to be rather culturally limited. We have 5% of the US where most of our research has come from, and then we have 95% of the rest of the world. So we want to be mindful of that. Additionally, we can't randomly assign culture, so we want to make sure that we're aware of that inherent selection bias. Additionally, difficulties can arise from researchers trying to account for intersections among different cultural identities, so maybe someone's gender and their race and their social class. The chapter also highlights areas where we can be more culturally sensitive, such as the language that we use in assessments, how we behave when we're interacting with another culture, and some of those things. Measurement issues are also important, and we want to be mindful of culture's effect on those. And so we briefly talked about the definition and defining these constructs and how we operationalize those, that's going to be impacted by culture, and so will the instruments that we use. And so we want to be mindful that a lot of those instruments have also been created and normed on white, middle-class participants. And so those constructs that are being measured may or may not actually be equivalent across cultural groups. So we want to examine the psychometric information and ask some different questions when we're thinking about this. And then finally, the interpretation and discussion of findings is a place where cultural considerations can really get fleshed out in conversation. So it's a place where the author can examine the cultural context of these participants and interpret the findings based on that, and then help readers to kind of understand how these results impact that target population, and so placing these results within the context of that particular culture that's being studied. And the authors of the text also encourage researchers to ask members of the target population to review the findings and get a sense of their observations or maybe their understanding of those findings as well. Some of the takeaways that we want to be mindful of when we're conducting research is that cultural groups really should be understood on their own cultural terms rather than comparing them to the majority groups. We also want to make sure that we're establishing a strong knowledge base about the target population and then being clear about how we operationalize definitions of the different cultural variables. And doing this by measuring cultural variables and interpreting those study results very carefully, that's going to optimize the reliability and validity of our studies. We want to make sure that we're generalizing based on one population. We need to be careful in does that actually generalize to a different population, and how do we go about best representing and respecting each cultural group.
We're going to discuss population issues from Hepner et al., Chapter 8, Research Design in Counseling. So we're going to cover three things: sampling theory, representing the population, selecting participants, what do we need to consider, and external validity in populations, can we generalize from this study? So Ezra and Nehemiah, they are all about following God's plan, showing character, and withstanding trial and frustration. And I think that's what we have to do as we go through this research process, which can be challenging. So sampling theory then, what is the goal? Creating a sample that is representative of the population. We only study a part of a population, so we need our conclusions from our research to apply to the rest of the population that is our target. Otherwise, it is not very helpful. We want to be able to make inferences, and they need to be valid. So that really depends on their representativeness. A treatment group is supposed to represent what the whole population would look like if they were treated. And so we want a random sample that gives us the greatest chance of representativeness. When you have a random sample, any member of a population has as much chance of being selected as another. If that doesn't happen, you have a biased sample. And those are your only two choices. Either you have a random or you have a biased sample. And we have problems with this. There's no guarantee that we're going to have a random sample, so we use statistics to improve the representativeness of our data, and we can also use larger samples. That really helps. Another statistical aid is setting an alpha level. That protects us against a type 1 error rejection of the null hypothesis when we shouldn't. So the alpha level is often set to 0.05, which really means that we have less than a 5% chance that if we rejected the null hypothesis due to significant findings, that we'd actually be doing that in error. So we have a 95% chance of getting this correct. That is sampling theory in a nutshell, getting a random sample that is generalizable. Now we're thinking about the practical considerations of how do we actually do this. And these are your 5 steps, and we're going to talk through them now. So first, we're going to define the target population. Who are we wanting to generalize to in the first place? What are their characteristics? What do we observe about them? What do they actually look like? We have a homogeneous and a heterogeneous trade-off. If you have a heterogeneous population where there's lots of difference, you can have a greater variance in responses, creating greater error variance, which reduces statistical power. And those are defined for you here. So now we want to shrink down that target population into who we could actually select, the participant pool. And those are who we can actually get to, who we can access. And that usually creates a bias of some kind. And the most common are systematic and characteristic. And thirdly, once we've gotten our participant pool, we want to actually select. And ideal is random, but often we can't do that, and so we are stuck with taking who is willing, able, or incentivized to take part. Once we have our participants, we want to establish the validity of this selection when it's not random. And a couple of things that play into that are the good enough principle. A non-random sample might allow rational inferences, but this must be theory-driven and carefully considered. And also we have the chi-square statistical test that can discern if a distribution is the same between our sample and the population. And so lastly, we want to decide how many of these participants we have to select. And we have to weigh the interplay of power, resources, and participants available. Increasing the participants increases our statistical power, ultimately our representativeness and generalizability. However, power is also impacted by the statistics we use, which have different powers, alpha level, directionality of a stats test, the effect size, and then the number of participants we select. So there's lots going into this. We've seen sampling theory and its impact through picking a randomized sample, and we've looked at how to do that. And thirdly, now we want to think about external validity. Can we generalize? And one of the first things we can do is solve the generalizability by building in characteristics. If I wanted to research Christians, for example, and not just those that are religious, I would add some characteristics such as a view of Jesus, or partaking in Christian sacraments, or church attendance. And that would really help me delineate Christians, not just those who are religious. Factorial designs are another really important tool for improving this external validity. We take status variables such as gender, social economic standing, and we see how they play into or interact with an independent variable. So we measure an interaction effect. A regression analysis can also be used similarly to a factor analysis in this case. And lastly, here we have some great questions to think about when you're talking about generalizability across populations. I will leave those for you to look at in your own time. But what have we seen? With population issues, critical pieces of information here. Sampling theory. We want to be representing the population, using random selection and considering an alpha level of 0.05. And then selecting participants, we want to define the target, create our pool, select the participants, check for validity, and check that the number is correct. And lastly, external validity. We want to be able to generalize, and we might have to make inferences. However, we want to think about the characteristics of the population, and we can use factorial designs. We're going to be theory-based.
We hope this video has helped you consider diverse perspectives
and population issues. Thank you for watching.